June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the boldest assault in the history of modern warfare. This was not just a landing, it was the moment that would decide the fate of Europe. In this video, we dive deep into the entire Normandy campaign, why the Allies were forced to open a second front, how they prepared for it, and what truly happened on the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. With rare archival footage and a cold strategic lens, you will see how a single day shattered the Nazi war machine and reshaped the entire 20th century. In 1944, Europe was like a body bound tight in the iron grip of Nazi Germany. From the Atlantic coast to the very borders of the Soviet Union, Hitler controlled nearly the entire continent, and every path to victory was locked shut under the barrels of the Wehrmacht. But amid that bleak landscape, one undeniable truth confronted Allied commanders to defeat Hitler: they had to open a new front in the West. Not a minor raid, but a strategic hammer blow, powerful enough to force the Germans to split their armies, ease the pressure on the Soviets, and crack open a gateway into the heart of Europe. From that necessity, Operation Overlord was born, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. More than a military plan, it was a promise from the free world that Europe would be liberated no matter the cost in blood. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have to cross the English Channel, charging into beaches sown with mines, artillery, and machine gun fire. But before sending them into the inferno of Normandy, the Allies had to answer one fatal question: where would they strike? Pas de Calais seemed like the obvious choice, the closest point, the shortest supply line, and the direction Hitler was certain the Allies would attack. And that certainty became his weakness. Thanks to the brilliant deception plan known as Operation Bodyguard, complete with dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and an entire ghost army commanded on paper by General Patton, the Nazis were fully misled. They concentrated their strength at Calais, while Normandy, with thinner defenses and long stretches of open beaches, emerged as a golden opportunity. But Normandy was no empty coastline. Before the Allies stood the Atlantic Wall, a colossal defensive network stretching thousands of kilometers, filled with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, heavy artillery minefields, and underwater obstacles. The Germans had spent years building it with one purpose: to annihilate anyone who dared set foot on France's shores. The question was simple but terrifying: could that wall be breached in a single day? Or would this become the bloodiest gamble of the entire Second World War? The answer begins on the shores of Normandy, where the world changed direction. Once the strategic door opened with the decision to strike at Normandy, another question emerged. How do you land tens of thousands of men from the sea when German tanks could be rolling in right behind them? As June 6th began, the answer wasn't on the water, it was in the night sky. At the stroke of midnight, the skies above the English Channel shook as more than 800 transport aircraft, Horsa gliders, fighters, and bombers surged toward France. This was not merely the opening act of D-Day, it was the decisive attempt to break Germany's counterattack network at its roots. If the paratroopers failed, the beach landings would be slaughtered. But if they succeeded, the entire left and right flanks of the invasion would be locked in place. On the eastern flank, the British 6th Airborne opened with one of the boldest strikes of the entire war. The Horsa gliders, engineless, lightless, gliding silently through the dark, slammed into fields near key bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal. Within mere minutes, Captain John Howard and his 181 commandos seized Pegasus Bridge and the Ranville Bridge so swiftly, the German sentries barely understood what was happening. With that near-perfect landing, the entire eastern flank of the invasion was secured. But on the western flank, everything unraveled. 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into strong winds, poor visibility, and a storm of German flak. Planes drifted off course. Hundreds of men dropped into marshes, rooftops, even treetops. Many drowned before they ever touched the ground. These haunting scenes force us to ask what kept them moving forward when the darkness swallowed every sense of direction. Yet it was within that chaos that the flexibility and grit of the American paratroopers shone brightest. Small groups regrouped on their own, pushed across flooded fields, seized crossroads, small bridges, and the vital routes German armor needed to counterattack Utah Beach. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first town in France to be liberated, a symbolic spark for the longest day. As dawn crept over the horizon, the outcome was unmistakable. Both wings of the invasion were locked in place. Though they paid in blood in the darkness, the airborne troops had completed the mission of opening the path for the largest amphibious assault in human history. Only one question remained: could the forces at sea break through the wall of steel before them as the first light of day touched the beaches? While paratroopers were fighting in the darkness to lock down the two flanks of the invasion, another force larger, louder, and far more decisive was advancing under the mist of dawn. If the night sky belonged to the airborne, then the morning of June 6th would belong to the sea. From this moment on, the battle shifted from pitch-black fields to the cold waters of the English Channel, where the future of Europe was closing in meter by meter. As the first pale light crept in, a sight unseen in all of human history rose over the horizon. More than 5,000 warships, transports, and landing craft stretched out like a floating city, ready to strike the 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. This was not merely a fleet, it was the culmination of the entire Anglo-American war machine, organized into precise task forces, each with missions timed down to the very minute. Below-deck infantrymen climbed into the small, heaving LCVPs. Cold wind salt spray and engine fumes mixed with the sound of vomiting. No one knew whether they would live or die in the next hour. Perhaps the most terrifying thing wasn't the bullets, but waiting for them. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the sea erupted. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire in unison on the German defenses lining the Normandy coast. The entire horizon flashed with fire. The land shook as if being carved away layer by layer by the heaviest guns the Allies possessed. While British and American bombers pounded the areas behind the beaches, a critical mistake unfolded. Many aircrews, afraid of dropping too close to friendly troops, released their bombs far inland, leaving much of the German fortifications at Omaha almost untouched. This error would cost thousands of American lives within the next hour. On the German side, confusion still reigned. Many commanders remained convinced this was only a diversion, still obsessed with the notion that the Allies will strike at Calais. But as the guns at Longues-sur-Mer answered back, and the coastal artillery began to tremble under fire, the truth became impossible to deny. The storm of steel had truly fallen upon Normandy. And now, caught between sea and shore, only one question remained: who would survive, as the Iron Gate of Europe was forced open by fire. As the naval bombardment fell silent, the waters off Normandy instantly became the launch pad for the moment that would decide Europe's fate. 6:30 a.m. H-hour, the exact minute when tens of thousands of Allied soldiers stepped out of their LCVPs and into the heaviest curtain of fire they had ever seen. This was the moment when every plan, every map, every briefing of the past months would be tested with real blood and real lives. And amid the gunfire, the crashing waves, and the lingering smell of cordite in the air, the great question thundered: could they break the steel gate into Europe? On the western flank at Utah Beach, fortune unexpectedly favored the Americans. Strong winds and currents pushed the landing waves nearly 2 kilometers off target, but the new landing zone had almost no heavy fortifications. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, made a decision that became legendary. We'll start the war from right here. Without hesitation or adjustment, he ordered the advance from this new point. American troops quickly pushed through light resistance, linked up with the 101st Airborne inland, and secured a firm beachhead within hours. At Utah, the battle seemed strangely smooth, but that contrast only made the tragedy on the neighboring beach even starker. For at Omaha Beach, the gates of hell truly opened. This was the beach where Allied plans collapsed hardest in the first minutes. The amphibious DD tanks, meant to knock out German defenses, sank almost entirely in the heavy surf, leaving the infantry with no armor support. On shore, the veteran German 352nd Division had arranged MG-42's mortars, mines, and obstacles in lethal fan-shaped kill zones. As soon as the American landing craft lowered their ramps, entire groups were wiped out. In just a few brutal hours, more than 2,000 men fell, turning Omaha into the bloodiest beach of D-Day. Yet even in the bleakest moment, the instinct to survive burned strongest. Small groups formed on their own crawled up the narrow bluffs and destroyed bunkers from behind. It was this raw determination that slowly shattered Omaha's defenses, though at an unimaginable cost. While the Americans struggled in the West, Sword Beach on the eastern side witnessed a very different tempo. British troops faced scattered but stubborn resistance, mostly from elements of the 700-member 17th Infantry Division. With specialized armor, Avers, Sherman DDs, and especially the ingenious engineering vehicles of Hobart's Funnies, the British smashed obstacles and advanced inland with speed. Their true objective was not the sand, but the city of Caen, the strategic crossroads that both sides knew would determine control of Normandy's right flank. Between Sword and the carnage of Omaha lay a middle ground, Gold Beach and Juno Beach, where the battle took on a different character. And it was here that the fight shifted once more from attrition to aggressive counterattack. At Gold Beach, Allied bombers overshot their targets, leaving most German bunkers intact. The 88mm guns perched atop cliffs fired straight down onto the beach, inflicting heavy losses in the opening minutes. But with strong engineering support and a methodical push to isolate and destroy each defensive pocket, the British gradually seized control. By midday, most of Gold Beach was firmly in their hands. Meanwhile, Juno Beach became the ultimate test of Canadian courage. Heavy waves sank many of their DD tanks, forcing the infantry to assault almost entirely unprotected. Their first-hour casualty rate nearly matched Omaha, yet they pushed forward, broke through the seawall, captured Courseulles-sur-Mer, and advanced farther inland than any other unit on D-Day. Viewed from above, the 5 Normandy beaches were like 5 chapters of one epic story each, with its own tone, but all built around the same question: Could human beings overcome machines, fortresses, the sea itself, and their own fear to reclaim freedom for an entire continent? D-Day answered with blood and with victory. When the 5 beaches were already stained with smoke and blood, one truth emerged: victory on D-Day did not come from plans, firepower, or machinery alone. It came from moments when human beings rose above fear to do what no one believed was possible. And from here, the story shifts to the acts of heroism, small breakthroughs that carried the weight of the entire invasion. At Omaha, where chaos reigned, General Norman Cota became the anchor for collapsing units. He charged to the front lines, shouting into the sea wind, the sentence that would become immortal: Rangers lead the way. In the hell of mortars and MG-42s, he gathered scattered soldiers into small assault teams, leading them through minefields, trenches, and up narrow bluffs to knock out gun nests from behind. Omaha was saved not by numbers, but by a refusal to surrender. Meanwhile, at Pointe du Hoc, 250 other Rangers were writing one of the most glorious chapters of the entire war. Under constant fire from above, they scaled a 30-meter cliff using nothing but ropes and grapnels, only to discover that the coastal guns they came to destroy were no longer there. But instead of giving up, they tracked the clues, found the 155mm guns hidden in an apple orchard, and destroyed them with thermite grenades. For 2 days, they held the cliff against repeated German counterattacks, isolated and running low on ammunition. These battles did more than clear the way for the invasion. They revealed the true power of D-Day, that when human beings are pushed to their limits, they can achieve the extraordinary. As the heroics at Omaha and Pointe du Hoc began to shift the tide, the broader picture of the invasion came into focus. Those small breakthrough points opened the way for a far greater objective, establishing a continuous, stable beachhead stretching across the length of Normandy. And by the afternoon of June 6th, those scattered fragments finally began to lock together, forming the first outline of a new front on the European continent. At Utah Beach morning, fortune transformed into genuine strategic initiative. American forces swiftly lie linked up with the 101st Airborne, using the crossroads seized at dawn to drive deeper into the Cotentin Peninsula. The town of Pupaville was liberated early, opening a corridor straight north toward the vital port of Cherbourg. Utah thus became the most stable landing zone of the entire front. Meanwhile, at Omaha, the fight remained a struggle against fate itself. But after a morning soaked in blood, the efforts of the small assault teams began to pay off. American troops finally reached the top of the bluffs, destroyed the remaining bunkers, and opened routes inland. When the message crackled over the radio, "Troops are off the beach," and moving up the bluff, the Allied command felt the weight lift from their shoulders. Omaha had not collapsed. The beachhead was holding. On the eastern flank, the Sword Juno gold sector began to fuse into a continuous line. By midday, British troops from Sword reached Pegasus Bridge and shook hands with the airborne soldiers who had held it since midnight. That moment was more than a tactical milestone. It became one of the defining symbols of D-Day, proof of flawless coordination between infantry and airborne forces. Canadian units from Juno and British units from Gold merged soon after, forming a beachhead nearly 20 kilometers wide, the strongest axis of advance in the entire invasion. Sensing the threat expanding, the Germans were forced to counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division launched a bold thrust into the gap between Sword and Juno, with some tanks even reaching near the shoreline. But British air power and anti-tank guns intercepted the spearhead in time. Thus, the only German counterattack of June 6th became a wasted blow, strong, but nowhere near strong enough to break a beachhead that was widening by the hour. By evening, the Normandy front had taken shape, spreading across the map like an expanding ink stain. The beachhead was no longer a question of if, but how far it would grow, and from that moment on, the road into France could no longer be closed. When the Normandy beachhead finally appeared clearly on the map by the afternoon of June the 6th, the Allies knew they had passed through the gate of death, but they also understood a cold truth. Getting off the beaches was only the beginning. The sand, the wrecked landing craft, the bullet-scarred shoreline were now behind them, and ahead lay a maze of Bocage-fortified towns and German units that were far from broken. From this initial victory, the campaign shifted into a new phase, holding what they had gained before nightfall. At Utah, General Collins made a prudent decision: halt, dig in, and fortify. American forces had penetrated deep into the Cottonton far too quickly, and pushing farther while both flanks were exposed would have been suicide. Utah became the firmest Allied foothold, but it was a victory born of caution, not recklessness. At Omaha, the problem was no longer the beach, it was everything behind it. The moment the Americans left the shoreline, they entered the bocage, ancient hedgerows and earthen walls, as tall as a man, forming natural green fortresses for German troops. Every step inland at Omaha cost blood. That slowdown created a dangerous issue. The gap between Omaha and Gold remained open. Meanwhile, at Juno, the Canadians had pushed farther inland than any other force, nearly 12 kilometers. But that distance turned them into an exposed spear point, with both flanks unsecured, advancing farther risked encirclement. So despite achieving the most impressive tactical gains of D-Day, the Canadians were forced to halt and wait for the rest of the line to catch up, a textbook reminder that fast is not the same as safe. Strategically, the greatest danger was the Normandy Gap, the empty space between Omaha and Gold. Crucial towns like Bayou-Corentin and Saint-Lô remained under German control, forming wedges that threatened to split the beachhead in two. If that gap wasn't sealed, the Normandy foothold could be severed within 24 hours. Yet amid all those tactical uncertainties, a quiet but monumental victory appeared: the British captured Arromanches. Not a large city, not a vital military hub, but the only site suitable for constructing Mulberry Harbor, the massive artificial port that would determine Allied supply capacity for weeks to come. In many ways, the future of the Normandy campaign was decided not just by guns and explosions, but by a floating harbor. When night fell on D-Day, every commander understood that they had won, but that victory was only the opening chapter of a far longer, harsher struggle, one that would demand more than anyone could yet imagine. As night slowly settled over Normandy on June 6th, the last gunshots still echoed from distant towns, but the fate of D-Day had already been sealed. The beachhead held the assault waves endured, and despite the hardships that still surrounded them, nothing could change the truth: the Allies had returned to the continent of Europe. And in that fragile moment between triumph and exhaustion, the final chapter of the longest day began, a chapter of silence, of aftermath, and of historical meaning that stretched beyond any single bullet. When darkness fully arrived, the Normandy beaches emerged as a landscape of devastation. Barbed wire twisted into tangled knots scattered among charred landing craft, bent steel frames overturned armored vehicles, and bodies still lying on blood-stained sand. This was no longer a beach. It was the imprint of a day when the world changed direction. Amid the wreckage, medics and nurses worked to the point of collapse, using dim flashlight beams to bandage wounds, inject morphine, and keep alive whatever lives could be saved for the next day. Many soldiers, too, drained to speak or think, fell asleep on the sand, their hands still gripping their rifles. Across the battlefield, the truth could no longer be denied. Hitler was finally forced to admit that this was the real invasion, not the feint he had stubbornly imagined. In a frenzy of strategic panic, he ordered emergency reinforcements to Caen-Carentan and Saint-Lô in a desperate attempt to hold the interior line. But those orders came far too late. As D-Day came to an end, the Allied victory was written clearly in numbers. 100 troops, thousands of tanks, guns, and supply vehicles had reached land. The price was steep, more than 10,000 casualties, including 4,400 dead in just 24 hours. But the strategic result was unmistakable. A gateway into Europe had been opened, and nothing could close it again. The meaning of this day reached far beyond military objectives. D-Day became the turning point of World War II, to the moment when the free world began reclaiming Europe from the darkness of Nazi rule. Those beaches once stained with blood, Utah Omaha gold, Juno sword, would later earn another name solemn and worthy. The beaches of freedom, for it was here that freedom began its return to Europe.